welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching Insolvency Diaries. After having achieved several milestones in the corporate insolvency, it's time to chart a route for individual insolvency. And that will be the next big thing, says the bankruptcy regulator. While the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code has laid down the framework for personal insolvency, it hasn't been notified as yet. Besides a resolution and bankruptcy process for individuals, the IBC also contemplates a fresh start process, a sort of a clean slate for debtors that meet the eligibility criteria. To understand how this fresh start process will work, who will benefit from it, and what we are hoping to achieve from it, I'm joined by Renuka Sane, Associate Professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Renuka, welcome to Insolvency Diaries. Renuka, you've been part of the IBBI working group on personal insolvency. So help us understand the thinking behind this fresh start process. It seeks to cover those with annual income less than 60,000 rupees, debt of less than 35,000 rupees, and assets less than 20,000 rupees with no dwelling unit. Who is meant to be the target group for this framework, and what are we trying to achieve from it?
So I think that the target group here is the extremely vulnerable population that has no hope in hell of actually repaying the debt. So as you can see, these thresholds are quite severe, if I may use that word, where people with no home ownership, people with assets that are less than 35,000, assets less than 20,000 are the ones that can actually apply. So it's actually going to apply to a very small subset of people. It's also important to know that the Fresh Start will only apply to unsecured debts. So it's, a very small category of debt and a very small category of people, those who are extremely vulnerable and those who cannot really repay their debts and need some way to actually make, a fresh start in their lives.
Okay, the framework allows, Renuka, only the debtor to file a fresh start application, and once the court accepts that application, the debt will be discharged and the creditor will then have to do a write-off. This sounds like a loan waiver with a makeover, and I come back to who is the target group for this process. Are we trying to do a makeover of the loan waiver process through IBC?
So in some sense, it is a waiver of debts. However, it's unlike the loan waivers for two reasons. One, it is the debtor who makes the choice of wanting to get a fresh start or not. And secondly, the debtor's the record of whether the debtor took the fresh start or not is noted. So while in a loan waiver, it almost seems as if it's a free-for-all waiver, in the case of a fresh start, the decision is made by the debtor, and he or she will have to weigh the trade-offs between getting a fresh start now and potentially getting expensive credit in the future. And in that sense, the debt waiver the loan waiver is different from a fresh start. And also the loan waivers have been kind of applied to all kinds of agricultural, debts so far. However, if the thresholds of the IBC are anything to go by, then even within the category of agricultural loans, I would expect that very few people will actually be able to apply for a fresh start. So in that sense, fresh start is much narrower than a loan waiver as we have seen in the past.
Okay, so if we are, hoping to address this vulnerable group, the literacy ratios there, again, Renuka, are not the best. So are we hoping that these people who, are earning less than 60,000 a year with debts less than 35,000, they will be able to go to courts to sort of seek a clean slate or a fresh start of sorts?
So right now, as the IBC envisages it, there is an intermediary who's called a resolution professional who has to guide the debtor through this process. And much will depend upon the regulations and the responsibilities that are put on this resolution professional to see how he or she actually, guides the debtor through this entire process of actually applying for a fresh start, of filling in the particulars of the loans, of answering any questions that, or any objections that the creditors might have. So much really rests on this intermediary. So it is not expected that the debtors will do this by themselves. They will of course need some hand holding. And I think that how the RP will play out remains to be seen.
Okay, I do want to get your thoughts on what is the end goal of this process, because is the market of these unsecured loans, growing at a pace and the defaults are high in this space, that we are having to introduce a process specifically for small debts like this?
The market for unsecured loans, I suppose, is largely informal, and it is going to be a challenge to enforce this particular process to the informal loans. Though if we can do that, that would be great, but I suspect that that will take some time. And in terms of the defaults on personal loans are concerned, I think that relative to corporate loans, they are not as high today, but as we've seen in the last few years, they have been growing. So I suspect that stress on personal insolvency and personal loans is growing, and we will see that there will be more defaults in this space going forward.
Okay, so like you mentioned, in this process, the credit history of the debtor will take a hit if he opts for this fresh start process, and the borrowing will get expensive for such an individual the next time around. So if I, as a debtor, I know that a potential loan waiver is coming in, and I know you've sort of distinguished the two, and a loan waiver of sorts won't even hit my credit history. Why will I, as a debtor, choose this process?
That's true. So, but the hope is that once you have an institutionalized mechanism of getting a loan waiver, then the impetus to actually announce these large-scale loan waivers will go down, because you don't have to wait for a loan waiver announcement. When you find yourself in distress, you can go and apply for the fresh start. So much will also depend upon the discipline through which these loan waivers get announced. And also, even if a loan waiver is announced, perhaps the IBC machinery can be used to actually implement the loan waiver. So therefore, one can envisage a situation where even if a loan waiver is announced, you have to go through the IBC machinery to actually avail of that loan waiver, and that will again reflect in your credit scores.
And how will that be a more robust process compared to what happens currently?
Because it's recorded more clearly that you took a loan waiver or you took a fresh start, while your current debts are wiped off, there is a record maintained that you took a loan waiver. The next time a creditor wants to give you a loan, the creditor can go through this record and make a judgment about whether the creditor wants to extend you a loan. And so therefore, this decision of whether to take a fresh start or a loan waiver will be a more thoughtful decision, and I hope that that will bring some more discipline into the process. So on one hand, there is an insurance, there is an ability to get a waiver if you are absolutely unable to repay the debts, but on the other hand, it might make credit more expensive for you. So one has to think about what kind of implications this will have on each debtor individually.
Okay, let me come to how this process will work for creditors and impact on them. Who essentially is this credit group, Renuka, who will get impacted by these sort of applications? Because it could be as informal as your money lenders. So is it what the sort of intent of the framework is?
That's right. So I think that if there was an ability to implement the fresh start, it would apply to all kinds of lenders, including money lenders, microfinance loans, SHGs, banks, NBFCs, what have you. But I think realistically it will be hard to implement this against money lenders. So presumably in the first few years of its operation, assuming that it does get notified, I expect that banks and NBFCs, this is the formal sector lenders that are giving unsecured loans, very low valued unsecured loans, are the ones that are likely to be affected by this.
Okay. Renuka, the secured creditors, like you mentioned, don't get affected by this process because they anyway have a security which they can enforce outside the personal insolvency process.
That's right.
So that will largely be, your unsecured creditors who will, get impacted by this process. The law gives them only very limited grounds to have a say in this whole process, because it's the debtor who goes to, let's say, the intermediary to say, oh, I want to start this process. and then the intermediary does some checks and then makes an application to the court. And at that time, and maybe at even the intermediary stage, the law envisages that you can, make only very limited arguments against the process, whether a particular debt qualifies for this process or not, or the amounts involved. How do you see this process pan out for such creditors, given that unlike a loan waiver, they may not even be compensated for the write-offs here?
I think that these are small valued loans, and if the creditor sees that the debtor has no ability to repay, then actually it might bring closure to those kinds of loans, and creditors may actually welcome it. See, at the end of the day, if the debtor has no ability to repay, and in this case, assuming that the assets and the income are so low and there is no home ownership as well, the creditor's ability to enforce against this debt would have been minimal anyway. So in that sense, I don't see the creditors having massive issues, because it's probably better for them to also write it off and move on than to actually try and recover something when you know that there is absolutely no hope of recovering. So in that sense, I don't see that the creditors will get highly affected. And on the question of whether they will give loans later, at least from international markets, we have seen that these kinds of procedures do not increase the cost of credit by too much. Especially if there is, what we call democratization of credit, where all kinds of players are coming and trying to give out loans, then creditors will be able to make their own decisions on whether they want to take the risk with someone who has taken a fresh start or not.
Renuka, the pace at which the corporate insolvency cases have progressed at the NCLT isn't exactly stellar. So is this the right time to operationalize the personal insolvency framework, even though I know that it's going to play out at the DRT? And to what kind of institutional framework will be required for this process?
So I think on the DRT question, it's not just personal insolvencies. I think that number is of general cases in front of the DRTs. They may or may not be only personal insolvency cases. And on the question of institutional infrastructure, yes, of course, we need to do a lot more in ensuring that there are more DRTs, or there are more judges on the DRTs, or the access to these kinds of mechanisms to people across the country is available. So right now, I think that there is certainly a constraint, and one will have to think about what kind of measures you will put in place so that this access becomes possible.
So is the thinking to deal with personal insolvency cases, is it outside of NCLTs or break it up into based on thresholds?
Yes, the law says that no. So the laws, the IBC designates the debt recovery tribunals as the adjudicating authority, whereas the NCLT only looks at the corporate insolvency cases. So as of now, it would be the DRTs who will look at all the personal insolvency cases. And I think that how to strengthen the DRTs is a decision that needs to be taken.
Well, the record is not really confidence-inspiring, if I can call it that. Renuka, thank you for giving us a quick glimpse of what the fresh start process can look like. And of course, as we move forward, the specific regulations and the framework will be notified by the government and the regulator. Thank you for joining us here on Insolvency Diaries. We'll see you next week.